Prepare to question everything you've ever known about childhood toys as we recount 3 terrifying tales of possessed dolls. Stay with us, if you dare, as we unveil the eerie details behind each haunting. But be warned, once you hear these stories, you'll never look at a doll the same way again. I was 10 years old the first time I realized the doll could read on its own. Growing up, my mother and I shared a modest home on the outskirts of town. We didn't have much money, but Mum found ways to keep me entertained, often hitting garage sales and thrift shops. That's where she discovered the doll, a small porcelain figure with painted blue eyes and a delicate pink dress. It came with a small cassette player sewn into its back, which read children's stories aloud. Supposedly, it worked only if you inserted one of the tapes Mum had collected, and the doll's voice would recite the text. A novelty, really, nothing more or less than a quirky second-hand toy. I remember the day Mum brought it home. The doll's curls were matted, and its dress was frayed at the edges, but it had a magnetic charm. I felt as though its glassy eyes followed me from the moment it entered the house. That night, Mom and I tested it out. She slid the first cassette, Fairy Tales for Sleepyheads, into the doll's player and pressed the worn play button. A tinny, childlike voice piped up, reading in a soothing monotone. I fell asleep halfway through the story, lulled by its rhythmic narration. Weeks passed, and I almost forgot about the doll. It sat on a shelf near my bed, propped against a stack of well-worn picture books. Mum and I had more pressing matters to deal with, like her late-night shifts and my homework. Every once in a while, I'd pop in a new cassette, let the doll read me a story, and promptly doze off before it finished. Nothing unusual, until the night I awoke to a voice in the darkness, whispering words in a language I couldn't quite understand. At first, I assumed I'd just left the doll on by accident. I fumbled for the lamp on my nightstand, only to discover the cassette player was empty. There was no tape in the compartment, and I distinctly remembered removing the batteries the day before to use in my portable radio. Yet still, the doll was reading. Its mouth, molded into a porcelain smile, hadn't moved. But the voice, eerie and scratchy, came from somewhere behind its painted lips. I froze, goosebumps rising on my arms as the doll's head remained slightly tilted, its eyes piercing the darkness. Panicked, I turned on every light in my bedroom and grabbed the doll by its plastic torso. The sound grew quieter, as if it sensed my presence. I flipped open the battery compartment, empty. I checked the cassette slot, empty. Yet the voice continued. Trembling, I ran to Mom's room with the doll clutched against my chest. She awoke with a start when I burst through the door. "What's going on?" she asked, groggy with sleep. "The doll," I managed to say. "It's reading something, but there's no tape, no batteries." Mom blinked, confusion turning quickly into annoyance. She knew I had a vivid imagination and probably thought I was making it up. Still, she took the doll from me. The voice had stopped by then, replaced by a deafening silence. "Maybe you dreamed it," Mom mumbled, placing the doll on her nightstand. "Let's go back to sleep. We can test it in the morning." That next day, I kept the doll at arm's length. Mom tested it out by popping in a tape, letting it read a short story about princesses. It behaved normally, no strange voices or odd activity. But I couldn't shake the memory of that dreadful, whispery monologue. And at night, I started hearing things. A rustling by the bookshelf, the faint echo of words drifting around the room. Every time I turned on the lights, the doll was exactly where I'd left it, silent and still. About a week later, I awoke to the strangest feeling that something was gently tugging at my blanket. Soft, almost imperceptible. When I opened my eyes, I realized the doll was no longer on the shelf. It was on the edge of my bed, facing me. Its eyes, usually so vacant, seemed to glimmer in the moonlight. And it was reading again, only this time the voice sounded almost alive, as if a real person were trapped inside that porcelain shell. My heart hammered in my chest. I stared at it, my body locked with fear. The words were twisted, mocking a classic bedtime story in some horrifying chant. Summoning every ounce of courage, I grabbed the doll and held it in front of me. I could feel a faint vibration, as if a heartbeat pulsed in its frame. My hands shook so badly that the doll nearly slipped from my grip. I raced out of my room, down the hall, and into the kitchen. Flipping on the overhead light, I pried open the doll's compartments again. No batteries, no tape. But the voice persisted, reading in that same relentless tone. I screamed for Mum. She rushed in, wearing her robe, her eyes darting from me to the doll in my hand. I could see her confusion give way to horror when she realized the reading voice was coming from within the doll, despite its empty compartments. Without a word, she jerked open the back door and motioned for me to follow her into the backyard. Together, we set the doll on the ground and rummaged for any tool we could find to pry it apart. Mum tried a screwdriver, but the doll's plastic seemed to resist every attempt, as though it had fused into a single impenetrable shell. "It won't break," Mom muttered, breath ragged. I could tell she was scared too. Never in my life had I seen her so shaken. "We need, maybe, a different approach." She ran back inside, rummaging through drawers and cabinets until she produced a small vial of holy water. My grandmother, deeply religious, had gifted it to her. I always thought it was more tradition than anything else, a symbolic keepsake. But at that moment, Mum clutched it as if it might be our only hope. She returned to where I stood, the doll still reading, its voice a haunting monotone. "Stand back," Mum said. She unscrewed the cap and began sprinkling droplets of holy water onto the doll's face. The instant the water touched its porcelain cheeks, the doll's voice shifted into a twisted shriek. It sounded as though it was in immense pain, wailing in a pitch so high it made my ears ring. I stumbled backward, watching in terror as the doll writhed on the ground, limbs contorting unnaturally. Dark liquid oozed from its eyes, staining the pink dress and pooling in the grass. Mum continued shaking the vial of holy water, drenching the doll's face and body. Suddenly, the shrieking cut off, replaced by a guttural hiss. Then, as quickly as it started, the doll collapsed onto the lawn, limbs askew. I could see steam rising where the holy water had touched. A faint crack appeared across its porcelain forehead, splitting its features into a grotesque version of itself. I wanted to run away, but my feet stayed rooted in the grass. Mom crouched down, breathing heavily, the nearly empty vial clutched in her hand. With a trembling finger, she dared to touch the doll's cracked forehead. It was hot. Too hot to be normal. "We need to get rid of it," Mum whispered. Without another word, she wrapped the doll in an old towel, carried it to the metal trash can in the corner of the yard, and dropped it inside. We heard one final hiss, a feeble attempt at its monstrous cry. Then it went silent. Mom, trying to spare me from the horror, quickly shut the lid and stood back. Her face was pale and glistened with sweat. Neither of us spoke. We didn't know what we had just experienced, whether it was a cursed spirit, demonic possession, or some inexplicable nightmare. But in that moment, all I felt was relief that the doll finally stopped reading. I rubbed my arms, still feeling goosebumps. As the lid closed, I prayed that its shrieks and the sinister stories it whispered would never return. I know it sounds silly, but I used to adore my Barbie collection. I had dozens of them lined up on my dresser. Some from older relatives, some new, some missing shoes or outfits. But they were mine, my personal plastic companions. However, none of them ever unnerved me like the one Barbie doll that seemed to have a mind of its own. Mom got her for me on my 7th birthday. Unlike the others with stiff limbs, this Barbie could bend her arms and legs at the elbows and knees. She had shiny blonde hair, a dazzling pink dress, and tiny feet arched for high heels. From the moment I unwrapped her, something felt off. The doll's painted eyes looked a little too lifelike, and her smile seemed to shift slightly when I wasn't looking. At first I brushed it off as a trick of the light or my imagination. I was a kid with an overactive mind. Why would a plastic doll be anything more than just a toy? I began playing with her, dressing her in different outfits, brushing her hair. But I noticed that when I left her in one spot, say on my bed, she'd somehow end up across the room, perched atop my dresser. At first I thought maybe I'd forgotten where I placed her. I was absent-minded. Maybe I'd just moved her and not remembered. But then it started happening daily, at times when I was absolutely certain of where I'd left her. I remember one instance vividly. I was late for school, so I hurriedly plopped Barbie on my windowsill and dashed out of my room. When I returned that afternoon, she was sitting on my desk, angled in such a way that her eyes would have been staring directly at my bed. It felt like an invasion, a breach of trust. My own toy was moving around without my involvement, and I had no explanation. I tried telling my mom, but she shrugged and chalked it up to me being forgetful. Maybe my little brother was messing with me, though I didn't have a brother. Maybe I had a friend over, though none visited that day. Eventually, I stopped mentioning it to her because every time I did, she got that, "Are you all right?" look in her eyes. But the situation escalated. I began waking up in the middle of the night to the soft sound of plastic limbs clicking. At first, I thought it was the house settling or the wind rattling my window, but each time I flicked on my bedside lamp, Barbie was in a different place than before I'd gone to sleep. Sometimes she'd be at my door, balanced precariously on her tiptoes. Other times she'd be on my pillow, her eyes inches from mine. Once I nearly rolled over and crushed her in bed, only to realize she'd somehow ended up under the covers. I started dreading nightfall. I'd hide the doll in boxes, bury her under piles of blankets in the closet, even lock her in a trunk. Yet, inevitably, I'd wake up to find her out in the open again, as if lured by some twisted sense of curiosity about me. I began to suspect that I was dealing with something beyond mere imagination. One evening, after returning from a classmate's birthday party, I stepped into my room and found Barbie sitting at my desk with a piece of paper in front of her. Crudely scrawled letters covered the page, like a child's first attempt at writing, though they spelled out no coherent words. My heart pounded so loud I wondered if the neighbors could hear it. I snatched the paper and stuffed it into my backpack, not daring to show it to Mom. She wouldn't believe me anyway. But I had to do something. Each day felt like a test of my sanity, as though Barbie was pushing me to see how far she could go. Her constant relocations turned my own house into a stage for her disturbing game. Finally, I confided in my best friend, Anna. She was a practical person, not easily spooked. She listened to my story without ridicule. When I finished, she suggested the unthinkable. Let's destroy it. The mere mention made me uncomfortable, but I was desperate. Anna and I decided we'd get rid of the doll once and for all. We planned it meticulously, choosing a night when my mom worked late and wouldn't ask too many questions. Under the cover of darkness, we snatched Barbie from where she sat, this time on my nightstand, as if waiting for me. I shivered when I picked her up. Her plastic limbs felt warmer than they should. The two of us crept downstairs and out to the backyard, to the old metal fire pit my dad had built years ago. Anna doused some kindling in lighter fluid while I held the doll. My hands shook. I felt a surge of guilt. After all, it was just a toy. Or was it? But then I remembered the countless nights of clicking plastic and the unnerving feeling that I was never alone in my room. Without allowing myself to overthink, I hurled the Barbie doll into the pit, onto the tinder. Anna struck a match, tossed it in, and we watched the flames catch. The fire roared to life, consuming the plastic. The doll's hair shriveled and curled, melting into the body, and the face contorted in a horrifying grimace. Perhaps it was just the natural effect of melting plastic, but it looked like she was screaming in agony. A plume of black smoke rose, carrying the stench of burning polymer. I forced myself not to look away. If this was the only way to end the horror, I needed to witness it. Eventually, all that remained was a twisted mass of melted plastic and charred limbs. I exhaled the breath I'd been holding. Anna and I tossed a handful of dirt onto the embers, extinguishing the last flickers of flame. My relief was overwhelming. We'd done it. I would finally be free of that doll's unsettling presence. I barely slept that night, but I felt safer than I had in months. When morning came, I gingerly walked into my bedroom, half expecting to see Barbie perched somewhere impossible. But she wasn't there. I felt the weight of dread lift. For the first time in forever, I could breathe without fear. Days passed with no sign of the doll. A week went by, and I started to believe our ordeal was truly over. It wasn't until the following Saturday morning that everything changed. I walked past the living room, still groggy from sleep, and glanced at the coffee table. My heart seized in my chest. Sitting upright, facing the doorway, was the Barbie doll. Her hair was singed short, and her once pink dress was charred black. Her skin was marred with dark swirls of melted plastic, and yet it was undeniably her. The same eyes, now holding a triumphant glint, stared straight at me. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. My thoughts churned. Anna and I had burned her, watched her melt into an unrecognizable heap, and yet here she was, returned to the house as though nothing had happened. Or perhaps as though everything had happened, and she was back to show me that whatever force animated her could not be destroyed by mere fire. In that endless moment, time seemed to stand still. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as the doll's mouth, locked in its permanent smile, seemed to grin wider than any piece of plastic should. I realized then that I would never be rid of this doll. No matter what I did, no matter how thoroughly I tried to erase her, she would return, her presence a ghostly reminder of whatever evil had latched onto her. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. Mom rushed in, concerned, but the moment she saw the charred doll, her eyes went blank with terror. She too remembered that we'd gotten rid of it, or at least believed so. But there it was, an inescapable horror, and I knew it wasn't done with me yet. I was the one who found him, slumped in the hallway, eyes wide and throat slashed. At the time, I didn't know what I was looking at. All I knew was that my neighbor, Mr. Cromwell, was dead, and the thing responsible was still in the house. I'd been tasked with taking care of Mr. Cromwell's home while he recovered from surgery. He'd been an ornery old man, prone to angry rants and shouting at anyone who came near. He had no family, and the only reason I agreed to help was that he promised me a little extra money for college. Every day after school, I'd stop by, feed the cat, collect the mail, and make sure the place was still standing. I should have known something was amiss when I heard him ranting in the living room on multiple occasions. Not just your average outburst. He was screaming at something, threatening it with a belt. One evening, I peeked through the doorway and saw him holding a battered porcelain doll by the arm. It was a small, delicate figure, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. Mr. Cromwell was shaking it violently, his face twisted with rage. "You think you can scare me?" he spat, raising his belt. "I'll show you fear." I shuddered at the sight. Who in their right mind would treat a doll that way? But I also knew Mr. Cromwell was prone to episodes. Perhaps it was a form of dementia or a twisted habit. Still, the look in his eyes unsettled me. The doll, chipped and scuffed from years of apparent mistreatment, had the saddest, most forlorn expression I'd ever seen on something that wasn't alive. A week later, Mr. Cromwell returned from the hospital early. He never told me why, just barked at me to stop coming around. I complied, relieved that I wouldn't have to witness more of his strange behavior. But then, late one night, I received a frantic phone call from him. He was screaming unintelligibly, as though fighting off some unseen attacker. The line went dead before I could get a word in. Concerned, I dialed the police, then grabbed my coat and ran to his house, which was just down the street. I found the front door ajar. Darkness filled the entryway. The stench of something stale and metallic hit me the moment I stepped inside. The hairs on my neck stood up. Heart pounding, I flicked on the hallway light, revealing Mr. Cromwell sprawled on the floor, blood staining his shirt and pooling beneath him. My stomach lurched as I realized how extensive his wounds were. I fumbled for my phone, calling 911 again, trying to explain in panicked gasps what I'd discovered. That's when I noticed movement in the far corner of the hallway, near the baseboard. The porcelain doll was sitting there, slumped against the wall, its chipped face flecked with droplets of red. My immediate thought was that it had been thrown during an altercation, but then I saw its hand. One of the tiny porcelain hands held a shard of broken mirror, the edges coated with the same dark crimson that stained Mr. Cromwell's shirt. I blinked, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me. Dolls don't move. Dolls don't kill people. Yet here it was, the evidence literally in its hand. The doll's head seemed to tilt, its unblinking eyes fixed on me in a silent, accusing stare. I froze, torn between disbelief and a deep primal fear that told me to run. In the back of my mind, I remembered the night I saw Mr. Cromwell beating the doll. He yelled that it was threatening him, that it was the devil incarnate. I'd written it off as a delusion. Now I wondered if he'd been telling the truth all along, or if he had somehow brought this upon himself. Maybe his abuse awakened something within the doll, some malevolent force that had grown with every blow, every cruel word. I inched closer, compelled by a morbid curiosity. My heart thundered in my ears. The doll's blank eyes felt like they were tracking my movements. I heard sirens in the distance, but they might as well have been miles away. In that singular moment, it was just me, the corpse of Mr. Cromwell, and the porcelain figure that shouldn't be alive, but was. As if in slow motion, the doll shifted. Its arm twitched, scraping the broken glass across the wooden floor, creating a high-pitched squeal. My breath caught. Was it going to come for me next? I couldn't tear my gaze away from its chipped face, marred by old cracks and new stains. Suddenly, the doll toppled over onto its side, the shard slipping from its hand. The front door burst open, and 2 police officers rushed in, guns drawn. I stumbled backward, arms raised to indicate I was unarmed, tears blurring my vision. My attempt to speak came out as a jumble of sobs and gasps. One of the officers checked Mr. Cromwell's pulse, grimacing and shaking his head. The other stared at the doll, confusion etched into his features. "What the hell happened here?" he demanded. I had no coherent explanation. Eventually, the paramedics arrived, confirming Mr. Cromwell's death. The police combed through the house, perplexed by the scene. a battered old doll lying near the victim with a makeshift weapon. They bagged the doll as evidence, presumably to test for fingerprints or any sign of tampering. But deep down, I knew they wouldn't find any rational explanation. How could you prove a doll committed murder? Weeks later, I was called to testify in an informal hearing about the circumstances of Mr. Cromwell's death. I told them what I saw, but they were skeptical. An old man, an apparent break-in or self-inflicted wound. No one wanted to believe a doll was involved. The official report listed the death as a homicide, with no identified suspect. The unanswered question of who or what hovered over the case. For a while, I had nightmares, visions of that doll creeping through the shadows, armed with a gleaming shard of glass, silently exacting vengeance for years of mistreatment. I still remember the look of abject terror frozen on Mr. Cromwell's face, the depth of his final realization that the doll he'd abused had turned on him. I tried to move on, but the memory clung to me. Then, one day I came home to find a small box sitting on my porch. No return address, no markings except my name, scrawled in shaky letters. My heart plummeted. I stared at the box for a full minute before daring to open it. Inside lay a single porcelain arm, chipped and splattered with dried blood. I gagged, nearly dropping the box. A note was tucked underneath the limb. The words were hastily written. "You know the truth." I stood there, shaking in broad daylight, on my own porch. I realized the doll, somehow, some piece of it, had found its way back to me, or someone had delivered it as a message. Either possibility was horrifying. My mind conjured images of the rest of the doll out there somewhere, piecing itself back together, waiting to strike again. The idea that the doll might be hunting for a new owner to punish was too much to bear. I tossed the box into the garbage that very moment and called the police. They took another report, but nothing came of it. In the weeks since, I haven't found any more pieces waiting for me. Still, every knock on the door, every unexpected package, sends shivers down my spine. I can't unsee what I witnessed that night. Can't unfeel the terror that washed over me when I realized a lifeless toy can carry a vendetta as potent as any living being. Even now, as I lie in bed, I can't help but glance at my closet. Any shadow, any shape that remotely resembles a small figure causes my heart to flutter. And though I try to reassure myself that dolls can't really come to life, I know better. I've seen what can happen when cruelty stirs something evil in an object that should have stayed forever silent.